I was having my morning coffee on the porch when I saw her marching up my driveway like she owned the place, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, and those oversized sunglasses perched on her nose despite the early morning fog that still clung to the streets of Lexington, Massachusetts. Sharon Whitmore, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, had that look on her face that told me this wasn't going to be a friendly, neighborly visit. "Yates Kimball," she called out before she'd even made it halfway up the drive, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about that wall." I set my coffee down on the little wrought iron table and stood up, already feeling my blood pressure rising. The wall she was referring to was the old stone wall that ran along the eastern edge of my property, separating my 2 acres from the nature preserve beyond. It was a beautiful piece of work, honestly, all fitted fieldstone that had weathered to a soft gray over the decades, covered in patches of moss and lichen that made it look like something out of a New England postcard. "Morning, Sharon," I said, keeping my voice level. "What seems to be the problem?" She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, pulled a folder from her clipboard, and waved it at me like she was summoning a demon. "This wall of yours violates HOA Regulations Section 12, subsection 4, regarding exterior structures and property modifications. It needs to come down." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "Sharon, that wall has been there since before your great-grandmother was born. I didn't build it." "That's irrelevant," she said, her lips pursing into a thin line. "When you purchased this property and signed the HOA agreement 3 years ago, you agreed to bring all structures into compliance with our regulations. That wall is not approved." "It's a historic stone wall," I said, walking down the steps to meet her at eye level. "It's probably been standing there since the 1800s, maybe earlier." "I don't care if it was built by the Pilgrims themselves," Sharon snapped. "It's not on the approved structures list, and it needs to be removed within 30 days, or you'll face daily fines of $200. I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. I'd dealt with Sharon before over equally ridiculous matters. 6 months ago, she tried to fine me because my mailbox was painted forest green instead of the approved hunter green. The difference was barely visible to the human eye, but Sharon had brought a color swatch and everything. "I'm not tearing down a century-old stone wall because it's not on your list," I said firmly. "That wall is part of the historic character of this property and this entire area." Sharon's face flushed red, clashing magnificently with her platinum blonde hair. "You have 30 days, Mr. Kimball. The notice will be in your mailbox by this afternoon." She turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, her sensible flats crunching on the gravel. I watched her go, then looked over at the wall in question. It stretched for about 200 feet along my property line, about 4 feet high, built without mortar in that traditional New England dry stack style. It was solid as the day it was built, whatever day that had been. The stones were covered in patches of moss, and small ferns grew in the crevices. It was beautiful, functional, and historic. There was no way in hell I was tearing it down. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, David Chen, who I'd unfortunately had to consult more than once since moving into this neighborhood. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Let me guess," David said without preamble. "Sharon Whitmore. How'd you know?" "Because it's always Sharon Whitmore." "What is it this time?" I explained the situation while walking along the length of the wall, running my hand over the cool, rough stones. David listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Here's the thing," he said finally. "She might actually have a case if the wall isn't explicitly grandfathered in your HOA agreement. When did you say the house was built?" 1923, I said. but the wall is definitely older than that. The real estate agent mentioned it when I bought the place, said it was one of the original property walls from when this was all farmland. Okay, that's good. We need to document that. I'm going to recommend you hire a surveyor and a historian to establish the age and historical significance of the wall. If we can prove it predates not just your HOA but possibly even the subdivision of the land, we might be able to argue it's a protected historical structure. How much is this going to cost me? I asked, though I already knew it would be worth it. The wall wasn't just a pile of rocks to me. When I'd bought this property after my divorce, looking for a fresh start, that wall had been one of the selling points. There was something solid and enduring about it, something that had survived through generations while everything else changed around it. A few thousand, probably. But cheaper than tearing down the wall and definitely cheaper than paying $200 a day in fines while we fight this. I agreed, and David said he'd send me some recommendations for surveyors and local historians who specialized in New England properties. We hung up, and I stood there for a while longer, just looking at the wall and thinking about all the hands that must have placed these stones. All the years it had stood here while farms became suburbs and horse paths became paved roads. The next morning, I was up early to meet with the surveyor David had recommended. His name was Thomas Reeves, and he'd been doing property surveys in Massachusetts for over 30 years. He arrived in a dusty pickup truck with surveying equipment in the back and a no-nonsense attitude that I immediately appreciated. "Show me this wall," he said after we'd shaken hands. I led him around the side of the house to where the wall began near my detached garage. Thomas walked along its length slowly, stopping every few feet to examine the construction more closely. He pulled out a camera and took dozens of photos, sometimes kneeling to get close-ups of particular stones or the way they were fitted together. "This is definitely old," he said after his initial inspection. "See how the stones are placed. This is traditional dry stack construction. No mortar, just carefully selected and fitted stones." This technique was common in New England from the colonial period through the early 1900s, but it fell out of use after that. "So how old do you think it is?" I asked. Thomas pulled out a tablet and started making notes. "I'll need to do some more research, check historical maps and property records, but based on the construction technique, the weathering patterns, and the types of stones used, I'd estimate this is mid to late 1800s. Possibly earlier." He spent the next 2 hours taking measurements, documenting the wall's position relative to the property boundaries, and examining old survey markers he found nearby. One of them, a stone marker partially buried in the ground, had a date carved into it, 1847. "Look at this," Thomas said, brushing dirt away from the marker. "This suggests the property boundaries were established in 1847. The wall aligns perfectly with this marker, which means it was likely built around the same time to mark the property line." I felt a surge of satisfaction. "So it's been here for almost 180 years. "At least," Thomas agreed. "I'll compile all of this into a formal report for you. Should have it ready in about a week. You'll want to get a historical survey done too. Check the town records for any historical designations or protections that might apply." I thanked him and wrote him a check for his services. As he was packing up his equipment, I saw Sharon's white Lexus slow down as it passed my house. She was staring at us, and I gave her a friendly wave. She didn't wave back. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Lexington to visit the town hall. The Historical Society had an office there, and David had suggested I talk to them about getting the wall documented. The woman at the desk, a friendly 60-something named Patricia, seemed genuinely excited when I explained what I was looking for. "Oh, the old stone walls," she said, her eyes lighting up. "They're such an important part of our town's heritage. So many of them have been destroyed over the years as old farms get developed. Do you have photos?" I showed her the pictures I'd taken on my phone, and she nodded enthusiastically. "This looks like it could be one of the original Hutchinson farm walls. The Hutchinson family owned most of that land in the 1800s. Let me pull up our archives." She disappeared into a back room and returned 20 minutes later with several rolled maps and a thick binder full of old photographs and documents. We spread the maps out on a large table, and she pointed to one from 1885. "See here. This shows the Hutchinson property boundaries. And look, there's a notation here about stone walls marking the eastern boundary, right where your property is now." I leaned in closer, squinting at the faded ink and careful handwriting. Sure enough, there were small symbols along the property lines with a notation that read, "Stone wall in good repair." "This is perfect," I said. "Can I get copies of these?" "Absolutely. We love when property owners want to preserve these historical features." Patricia made copies of everything relevant while telling me stories about the Hutchinson family, who had been prominent farmers in the area before the land was eventually sold off and developed. "There's actually a state program for protecting historic stone walls," she added as she handed me a folder full of documents. "Massachusetts considers them important cultural landscapes. You might be able to get the wall officially registered as a historic structure." I left the Historical Society feeling much better about my chances. Sharon Whitmore might be president of the HOA, but she wasn't the final authority on historical preservation. The official HOA notice arrived in my mailbox that evening, just as Sharon had promised. It was printed on official letterhead and cited various subsections of the HOA bylaws regarding unauthorized structures. According to the notice, I had 30 days to remove the stone wall completely and restore the property line to its natural state, whatever that meant. Failure to comply would result in fines of $200 per day, plus the cost of removal if the HOA had to hire contractors to do it themselves. I took a photo of the notice and texted it to David, along with the documents I'd gotten from the Historical Society. He called me back within the hour. "This is good stuff," he said. "Really good. The historical documentation is going to be key, but I want to be proactive here. I think we should request a formal hearing with the HOA board before the 30 days are up. We'll present all our evidence, show them why the wall should be protected, and hopefully they'll see reason." "You don't know Sharon," I said. "Reason isn't really her thing." "Maybe not, but there are other people on that board. If we can convince them, Sharon will be outvoted." I agreed to the plan, though I wasn't optimistic. I'd been to one HOA meeting since moving to the neighborhood, and it had been a nightmare of petty complaints and power plays. Sharon ran those meetings like a dictator, and the other board members mostly just went along with whatever she said. The next week was busy. Thomas Reeves sent me his official survey report, which was incredibly detailed and professionally done. He documented everything about the wall, from its precise measurements to its construction techniques, to its alignment with historical property markers. His conclusion was clear. The wall had been constructed sometime between 1840 and 1860, making it between 165 and 185 years old. I also hired a local historian, Dr. Margaret Foster, who specialized in New England agricultural history. She came out to examine the wall and spent an entire afternoon taking photos, making sketches, and examining the types of stones used. Her report was even more detailed than Thomas's, complete with historical context about farming practices in pre-Civil War Massachusetts and the cultural significance of stone walls in New England. These walls are monuments to the labor and ingenuity of early New England farmers, Dr. Foster explained as we walked along the wall. Building them was backbreaking work. They had to clear the fields of stones before they could plow, and rather than waste those stones, they used them to mark property boundaries and keep livestock contained. Each wall represents hundreds of hours of human labor. Sharon Whitmore thinks it's just an unapproved structure, I said. Dr. Foster looked genuinely offended. That wall is a piece of living history. Tearing it down would be like demolishing a historic building. Actually, given how many of these walls have been destroyed, it's possibly more significant than many buildings. Armed with all this documentation, David sent a formal request to the HOA board for a hearing to discuss the wall. Sharon tried to deny the request, but David pointed out that according to the HOA bylaws, any homeowner facing fines over $500 had the right to a hearing before the board. Sharon had no choice but to schedule it. The hearing was set for a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after Sharon's initial visit. It was held in the community center, a modern building at the entrance to the neighborhood that also housed a small gym and a meeting room. I arrived 15 minutes early with David, both of us carrying folders full of documentation. The room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs facing them for residents. Sharon was already there, sitting in the center seat at the board table, shuffling through papers with an expression of deep concentration. The other board members filtered in over the next few minutes. Robert Henderson, a retired accountant who always looked vaguely uncomfortable. Jennifer Costa, a real estate agent who I'd always found reasonable. And Paul Mackenzie, a middle-aged software engineer who rarely said much. To my surprise, the resident seating area started filling up too. My next-door neighbors, the Johnsons, came in and gave me encouraging smiles. Then came the Patels from down the street and the elderly Morrison couple who lived near the entrance to the neighborhood. By the time the meeting started, there were at least 20 people in attendance. Sharon called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. Yes, she actually had a gavel. We're here to discuss the matter of the unauthorized stone wall on the property of Yates Kimball at 47 Orchard Lane. Mr. Kimball has requested this hearing to contest the order to remove the structure. That's correct, David said, standing up. My client has compiled substantial evidence that this wall is a historic structure that predates not only this HOA but the very subdivision of this land into residential properties. We believe it should be protected, not destroyed. Sharon's expression didn't change. The age of the structure is irrelevant. When Mr. Kimball purchased his property, he agreed to abide by all HOA regulations, which clearly state that all exterior structures must be approved by the board. This wall was never approved. Because it existed long before your board did, David countered. We have survey reports and historical documentation proving this wall was constructed in the mid-1800s. I'd like to see that evidence, Jennifer Costa said, speaking up for the first time. David opened his folder and began distributing copies of everything we'd gathered. Thomas Reeves's survey report, Dr. Foster's historical analysis, the maps and documents from the Town Historical Society, and photos documenting every aspect of the wall. The board members took their time reviewing the materials, and I watched their faces carefully. Robert Henderson looked genuinely interested, studying the old maps with obvious fascination. Jennifer Costa was reading Dr. Foster's report intently. Paul Mackenzie flipped through the survey report, his engineer's mind clearly appreciating the technical detail. Only Sharon seemed unmoved, barely glancing at the documents before setting them aside. "This is all very interesting," Sharon said when everyone had finished reading, "but it doesn't change the fundamental issue. The wall is not on our approved structures list. That means it needs to be removed, or Mr. Kimball needs to pay for its approval and any necessary modifications to bring it into compliance with our standards." "What standards?" I asked, unable to keep quiet any longer. "It's a stone wall. It's been standing there for 180 years doing exactly what it's supposed to do. What could possibly need to be modified?" Sharon pulled out another document. "According to our regulations, all walls and fences must be no more than 3 feet high without special approval. This wall is 4 feet high. Additionally, all exterior structures must be maintained in pristine condition. This wall has moss and plants growing on it, which constitutes poor maintenance." I stared at her in disbelief. "The moss is part of what makes it historic. And the height limit is for new construction, not for structures that existed before the HOA was even established." "The bylaws don't make that distinction," Sharon said smugly. Jennifer Coster raised her hand. "Actually, Sharon, I think they might. Can we look at Section 12 again?" Sharon's jaw tightened, but she pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws. Jennifer read through the relevant section, then looked up. "It says here that regulations apply to new construction and modifications. A structure that already existed and hasn't been modified wouldn't fall under this section." "The entire property became subject to HOA regulations when Mr. Kimball purchased it and signed the agreement," Sharon insisted. "That's not how historic preservation works," David interjected. "Massachusetts state law protects historic structures, and that protection supersedes HOA regulations. If we need to, we can take this to court, but I'd prefer to resolve it here. This wall is a valuable historic asset, not just for my client's property, but for the entire community." Paul Mackenzie spoke up for the first time. "I actually think the wall is pretty cool. I've walked past it on my morning runs. It's definitely one of the nicer features in the neighborhood." "It's also probably increasing property values," Jennifer added. "Historic features are attractive to buyers." Sharon looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. "We can't just ignore our own regulations because something is old. That sets a dangerous precedent. What's dangerous is destroying an irreplaceable piece of local history because of a bureaucratic technicality," Robert Henderson said quietly. I was surprised to hear him speak up. He usually just went along with whatever Sharon said. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with Sharon arguing her position and the other board members gradually aligning against her. Members of the audience started speaking up too, several of them mentioning that they'd always admired the wall and considered it a neighborhood asset. Mrs. Morrison even stood up and said her grandfather had told her stories about stone walls like mine from when he was a boy. Finally, Jennifer Costa made a motion. "I move that we recognize the stone wall on the property at 47 Orchard Lane as a pre-existing historic structure, exempt from current HOA regulations regarding new construction. Furthermore, I move that we encourage its preservation as a valuable community asset." "I second that motion," Robert Henderson said immediately. Sharon looked furious, but she had no choice except to call for a vote. Jennifer, Robert, and Paul all voted in favor. Sharon was the only vote against. The motion passed. I felt relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. Sharon slammed her gavel down with unnecessary force. "Meeting adjourned," she snapped, then gathered her papers and stalked out of the room without another word. Several neighbors came up to congratulate me afterward, and I thanked them all for their support. David was pleased with the outcome, though he warned me that Sharon might try to make trouble in other ways. "Document everything," he advised. Keep records of all your interactions with her and the HOA. People like Sharon don't give up easily. He was right about that. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Sharon driving past my house more frequently, always slowing down to stare at my property. Then I started getting notices about other supposed violations. My grass was allegedly a quarter-inch too long. My porch light was supposedly too bright. My car was apparently parked at a slight angle in my driveway instead of perfectly straight. Each notice came with threats of fines, and each one required me to document compliance and respond in writing. It was harassment, pure and simple, and it was costing me time and stress. I documented everything and sent copies to David, who advised me to respond to each notice calmly and professionally while building a case for harassment. Things came to a head about 6 weeks after the hearing. I was working in my home office when I heard machinery running outside. I looked out the window and saw a truck with Henderson's Landscaping painted on the side parked near the stone wall. 2 men were unloading equipment, and Sharon was standing nearby talking to them and pointing at the wall. I ran outside, my heart pounding. What's going on here? Sharon turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, Yates, I'm having the HOA's landscaping crew do some maintenance work along the property lines. Don't worry, it won't affect you at all. One of the workers was approaching the wall with what looked like a pressure washer. Hold on, I said, moving to block his path. That wall is on my property. You can't do any work on it without my permission. Actually, Sharon said, pulling out yet another document, according to the survey filed with the town, the property line runs along the center of the wall. That means half of it is technically on HOA common property. I stared at her. That's not what the survey report said. Thomas Reeves confirmed the wall is entirely on my property. Well, I had my own surveyor take a look, Sharon said, and he determined that the wall straddles the property line. So I'm well within my rights to maintain the HOA's portion. By pressure washing it, that could damage historic stone. You'll strip off the moss and lichen and possibly even damage the stone itself. Sharon shrugged. The HOA is responsible for maintaining its property to community standards. The wall is covered in moss and plants, which is unsightly. We're simply cleaning it. I pulled out my phone and called David immediately. While it was ringing, I positioned myself between the workers and the wall. Don't touch that wall until my lawyer gets here. The workers looked uncomfortable and glanced at Sharon, who had her arms crossed and was tapping her foot impatiently. David answered, and I quickly explained the situation. He told me to take photos of everything and everyone, which I did, and to not let anyone touch the wall. I'm calling the police, I told Sharon. This is destruction of private property. Call whoever you want, she said. I have every right to maintain HOA property. I did call the police, and an officer arrived about 15 minutes later. His name was Officer Martinez, and he listened patiently as both Sharon and I explained our sides of the story. I showed him Thomas Reeves's survey report on my phone, which clearly showed the wall was entirely on my property. Sharon showed him a different survey report that claimed the wall straddled the property line. This is a civil matter, Officer Martinez said finally. I can't force anyone to do or not do anything here. You need to resolve this through the courts. But if she damages the wall, that's destruction of property, I argued. Only if a court determines it's your property, the officer said. Right now, you have 2 survey reports that contradict each other. You need to get that sorted out legally. Sharon looked triumphant. As soon as Officer Martinez left, she nodded to the workers. Go ahead. Wait, I said desperately, then turned to the workers directly. Look, I'll pay you whatever she's paying you plus 50% more if you don't touch that wall today. Just give me a day to get this sorted out legally." The workers looked at each other, then at Sharon, then back at me. One of them, an older guy with a weathered face, shook his head. "Sorry, buddy, but we have a contract with the HOA. We can't just walk away from that." I tried one more thing. "That wall is protected under Massachusetts historic preservation law. If you damage it, you could be held personally liable. I have documentation from professional historians proving it's nearly 180 years old." That made them hesitate. The younger worker pulled out his phone and started typing. After a minute, he showed something to his coworker. They had a whispered conversation, then turned to Sharon. "Madam, we're going to need to see proof that you have the legal right to authorize work on this structure," the older worker said. "If it's really historic, we could get in serious trouble for damaging it." Sharon's face went red. "I'm the president of the HOA. That's all the authorization you need." "Sorry, but that's not how it works," the worker said. "We need to see a legal document proving the HOA owns this wall, or at least part of it. Otherwise, we're not touching it." Sharon sputtered and argued, but the workers stood firm. Finally, she threw her hands up in frustration. "Fine, I'll get the documentation. Don't leave, I'll be right back." She stalked off to her car and drove away, tires screeching. The workers immediately started packing up their equipment. "We're not waiting around for her," the older one told me. "This is lawsuit written all over it. Between you and me, she's probably wrong about the property line. We've done work in this neighborhood before, and those old stone walls are almost always entirely on one property or the other. They weren't built to straddle property lines." I thanked them profusely and they left. Then I called David back and told him what had happened. "Okay, this has escalated beyond simple HOA disputes," David said. "I think Sharon might have actually commissioned a fraudulent survey. That's a serious crime. We need to move fast. I'm going to file for an emergency restraining order to prevent any work on or near the wall until this is resolved. I'm also going to contact the State Historical Commission about getting the wall protected status." "Do whatever you need to do," I said. "This has gone far enough." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal activity. David filed the restraining order and got it approved within 24 hours. Sharon was served with papers ordering her to cease any activity related to the stone wall until a court hearing could determine the property boundaries. David also filed a complaint with the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors about the surveyor Sharon had allegedly hired, asking them to investigate whether the survey was legitimate. That investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, an investigator from the board contacted David. The surveyor Sharon claimed to have hired had no record of ever doing any work on my property. When they contacted him directly, he confirmed that Sharon had approached him about doing a survey, but he declined the job because she'd essentially asked him to produce a report saying what she wanted it to say, regardless of what the actual measurements showed. He told her that would be unethical and possibly illegal. In other words, the survey report Sharon had shown me and the police was completely fabricated. She'd created a fake document and tried to use it to justify damaging my property. David was gleeful when he called me with the news. "This is beyond HOA overreach now. This is fraud, forgery, and attempted destruction of property. I'm recommending we bring criminal charges." "Will that actually work?" I asked. "I think so." She fabricated an official document and tried to use it to commit what amounts to vandalism. The district attorney's office should be interested in this. David contacted the DA's office, and they agreed to investigate. A detective named Sarah Williams was assigned to the case. She came to interview me at my house. and I showed her everything. The real survey report from Thomas Reeves, the fake one Sharon had produced, photos of the confrontation with the landscaping crew, and all the documentation about the wall's historic significance. Detective Williams was thorough and professional. She also interviewed Thomas Reeves, the workers from Henderson's Landscaping, and Officer Martinez, who'd responded to my initial call. She tried to interview Sharon, but Sharon refused to speak without a lawyer present. "That's her right," Detective Williams told me after one of our conversations. "But it's not a good look. If she had a legitimate explanation, you'd think she'd want to share it." The investigation took about 3 weeks. During that time, Sharon was conspicuously absent from the neighborhood. She didn't drive past my house, didn't send me any violation notices, and didn't attend the next HOA board meeting. The other board members seemed relieved by her absence. Jennifer Costa was serving as interim president, and she was running things much more reasonably. Then came the day I'd been simultaneously anticipating and dreading. Detective Williams called me in the morning. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. We're arresting Sharon Whitmore this afternoon. We have enough evidence for charges of forgery, fraud, and criminal mischief. Thought you'd want to know." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I'd never wanted things to go this far, but Sharon had pushed and pushed until she'd crossed legal lines. She'd fabricated documents and tried to destroy a historic structure out of pure spite. Actions had consequences. I didn't watch when the police came to arrest Sharon, though I heard about it from multiple neighbors. Apparently, she'd screamed and protested and insisted it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was taken to the police station, processed, and released on bail later that evening. The local news picked up the story a few days later. "HOA president arrested for forgery in stone wall dispute," read the headline. The article detailed the whole saga, from Sharon's initial demand that I remove the wall to her fabrication of a survey document. It even included quotes from Dr. Foster about the wall's historic significance. The story went viral locally, with people on social media debating HOA power and the importance of historic preservation. Some people were on my side, praising me for standing up to HOA overreach and protecting a piece of local history. Others thought I was being difficult and should have just followed the rules, regardless of whether those rules made sense. A few people even suggested the whole thing could have been avoided if I just talked to Sharon more reasonably, which made me laugh bitterly. As if I hadn't tried that from the very beginning. The criminal case took several months to wind through the system. Sharon pleaded not guilty initially, but her lawyer eventually convinced her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges of creating a fraudulent document, and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, a substantial fine, and community service. She also had to officially resign as HOA president and was banned from serving on the board again. The civil side of things was resolved more quickly, with the criminal case establishing that Sharon's survey was fraudulent. There was no question about the property boundaries. Thomas Reeves's survey was accepted as accurate, confirming that the wall was entirely on my property. The restraining order was made permanent, and David filed a civil suit against Sharon personally for harassment and attempted destruction of property. That suit settled out of court. Sharon agreed to pay my legal fees plus additional damages. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to cover everything I'd spent defending my property and compensate me for the stress and time she'd cost me. More importantly, the publicity around the case prompted the town of Lexington to take action to protect historic stone walls. The town council passed an ordinance recognizing stone walls built before 1900 as protected historic structures, requiring special permits and historical review before they could be altered or removed. My wall was one of the first to be officially registered under the new ordinance. The Massachusetts Historical Commission also got involved, creating a statewide database of historic stone walls and offering grants to property owners who wanted to preserve and restore them. Dr. Foster was hired as a consultant for the project, and she used my wall as one of her case studies. Throughout all of this, life in the neighborhood gradually returned to normal. Jennifer Costa was officially elected as the new HOA president, and she immediately set about reforming how the organization operated. She revised the bylaws to include protections for pre-existing structures, created a more reasonable process for addressing violations, and eliminated a lot of the petty rules that Sharon had loved to enforce. The HOA is supposed to maintain property values and help the community, not terrorize homeowners over nonsense, Jennifer said at one of the reformed meetings. We're going back to basics. The neighborhood felt different after Sharon was gone. People were friendlier, more relaxed. There were fewer violation notices going out, and the ones that did go out were for legitimate issues like actual safety hazards or serious maintenance problems. The HOA started organizing community events like block parties and holiday celebrations, instead of just acting as an enforcement arm. My neighbors, many of whom had suffered under Sharon's regime but had been too afraid to speak up, started sharing their own stories with me. The Johnsons told me about how Sharon had tried to fine them because their daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway were supposedly a violation of the Clean Driveways rule. The Patels had been threatened with fines because they'd planted tomatoes in their front yard garden instead of purely decorative plants. Paul Mackenzie had been cited multiple times for having his garage door open during the day while he worked on his car. Everyone had a Sharon story, and now that she was gone, they could finally laugh about them instead of living in fear of the next violation notice. As for me, I became something of a minor local celebrity. The Historical Society asked me to give a talk about the stone wall and the importance of preservation. I was interviewed for a regional magazine article about historic New England architecture. A local elementary school even brought students to my property on a field trip to learn about traditional stone wall construction. But the best part was just being able to enjoy my property without constantly looking over my shoulder. I'd sit on my porch in the evening with a glass of wine and watch the light change on the stone wall as the sun set. I'd run my hand over the cool stones and think about all the history they'd witnessed, all the seasons they'd endured. Thomas Reeves came back one more time, about 6 months after everything was settled, to do a follow-up survey for the Historical Commission. We walked the length of the wall together, and he pointed out details I'd never noticed before. See how these stones here are a different color, he said, indicating a section near the middle. This was probably repaired at some point, maybe in the early 1900s, but they used the same traditional techniques, so it's historically significant too. How long do you think it will last? I asked. Thomas smiled. If it's maintained properly and nobody tries to pressure wash it or tear it down, another 100 years, easy. These walls were built to last. The farmers who built them knew that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would need those boundaries to still be clear. I thought about that a lot in the following months. The people who'd built my wall probably never imagined that almost 2 centuries later, someone would fight to preserve their work. They'd been solving practical problems, clearing fields and marking boundaries, not creating monuments. But time had turned their practical work into history, their stone wall into a legacy. One Saturday morning in early fall, I was outside examining a section of the wall where some stones had shifted slightly over the winter. I was trying to decide if I needed to call a professional stonemason or if it was just normal settling when a car pulled up. I didn't recognize it at first, but then Dr. Foster got out, along with a young man carrying camera equipment. "Yates," she called, waving. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by. This is Marcus Perry from New England Historical Review. He's doing a feature on historic stone walls, and I told him yours was the perfect example." I didn't mind at all. Marcus turned out to be a skilled photographer, and he spent over an hour taking pictures of the wall from every angle, in different lights, with different lenses. He interviewed me about the whole saga with Sharon and the HOA, shaking his head in disbelief at some of the details. "It's incredible how much effort she put into trying to destroy something irreplaceable," he said. "All because of what, spite? Control?" "I think it was about power," I said, watching him adjust his camera settings. "Sharon saw the HOA as her personal kingdom. When I challenged her authority over this wall, it became about proving she was in charge no matter what." "Well, she proved she wasn't, at least," Dr. Foster said with a laugh. The article came out 2 months later, a beautiful spread with Marcus's stunning photographs and a detailed history of New England stone walls. My wall was featured prominently, along with the story of its preservation. The article ended with a call to action, urging property owners and communities to protect these historic structures before they were all gone. I bought several copies of that magazine and sent them to people who'd helped along the way. David Chen, Thomas Reeves, Jennifer Costa, even Officer Martinez, who'd been stuck in the middle of my property dispute. Everyone seemed pleased to see the story have such a positive ending. The winter after everything was resolved was the first time I really felt at peace in my home. I'd sit by the window on snowy evenings and watch the snow pile up along the top of the stone wall, creating a white ribbon that made the boundary between my property and the preserve beyond even more beautiful. Sometimes deer would pass along the wall, and I liked to imagine they were following the same path their ancestors had used for generations, when the wall was young and the men who built it might have been working nearby. Spring brought new growth. The ferns that grew in the crevices between the stones unfurled their fronds, and the moss turned a brilliant green after the spring rains. I planted a garden near the wall, nothing fancy, just tomatoes and peppers and some herbs. I used traditional techniques I'd read about, working with the natural slope of the land the way the old farmers would have. Jennifer Costa came by one afternoon to officially close out the HOA case. She brought a letter, signed by all the board members, officially recognizing the stone wall as a protected historic structure and apologizing for the trouble Sharon had caused. "We also voted to create a new fund," Jennifer said as we sat on my porch, "for maintaining and preserving historic features in the neighborhood. Your wall will be the first project. We want to hire a professional stonemason to do any needed repairs at HOA expense." I was surprised and touched. "That's really generous." "It's the right thing to do," Jennifer said. And honestly, property values in the neighborhood have actually gone up since all the publicity about the wall. Turns out people like historic character. "Who knew?" She grinned. We talked for a while about her plans for the HOA, how she wanted to make it a positive force in the neighborhood instead of just an enforcement mechanism. She asked my advice on a few things, which I found ironic given how much trouble I'd caused, but I appreciated being asked. After she left, I walked the length of the wall one more time, something I found myself doing more and more often. It had become a kind of meditation, this slow walk beside the stones, letting my hand trail along their rough surface. I knew every dip and rise now, every place where stones had been fitted with particular skill, every section that showed its age or told a story of repair and maintenance over the decades. I thought about Sharon sometimes, wondered if she ever regretted how far she'd taken things. Probably not. People like her rarely had that kind of self-awareness, but I chose not to let bitterness take root. The wall had stood for 180 years through weather and time and change. It had survived Sharon Whitmore's assault too, and it would be here long after all of us were gone. That thought was comforting somehow. In a world where everything felt temporary and uncertain, where relationships ended and jobs changed and nothing seemed permanent, this wall endured. It had been here before me and would be here after me, a testament to the labor of unknown hands and the persistence of well-made things. The stone mason came in early summer. His name was Frank Morrison, and he was the grandson of the elderly couple who lived near the neighborhood entrance. He'd learned traditional stone wall construction from his father, who'd learned it from his father. This was family knowledge, passed down through generations. Whoever built this knew what they were doing, Frank said admiringly as he examined the wall. See how they selected stones that naturally fit together, and the way they've laid it so water drains away instead of pooling. This is craftsmanship. He made a few small repairs, replacing stones that had cracked over the winter and restabilizing a section that had shifted. But mostly he just reinforced what was already there, treating the wall with the respect it deserved. He worked slowly and carefully, and I could tell he loved his craft. You don't see this kind of work anymore, he told me as he fitted a stone into place. Everyone wants everything fast and cheap now, but these old walls, they were built to last because they had to last. The farmers who built them couldn't afford to do the work twice. I asked him to teach me some of the techniques, and he was happy to. We spent several afternoons working together, and he showed me how to select stones that would fit together, how to place them for maximum stability, how to build without mortar so the wall could flex and shift with the seasons without cracking apart. The secret is that nothing's permanent, Frank explained. The stones can move a little bit, settle, shift. That's why these walls last. They're not fighting against nature, they're working with it. I thought about that metaphor a lot. Sharon had tried to fight against history and nature, to impose her rigid rules on something that had existed long before those rules were written. She'd lost, because you can't fight reality. The wall was always going to be historic, always going to matter, regardless of what any HOA regulation said. By the end of summer, the wall was in better condition than it had probably been in decades. Frank had done beautiful work, and you couldn't tell which stones he'd replaced or adjusted. Everything blended together seamlessly, old and new united in function and purpose. The neighborhood held a block party in September, the first one in years according to longtime residents. Jennifer had organized it as a way to build community and celebrate the changes in the HOA. They set up tables in the community center parking lot with food and games for kids, and a small band playing classic rock covers. I went reluctantly, still not entirely comfortable with being the center of attention, but people kept coming up to thank me. For fighting the HOA, for preserving the wall, for standing up to Sharon. It was embarrassing and gratifying in equal measure. You did what a lot of us wanted to do but were afraid to, one neighbor told me. Sharon needed to be stopped. Toward the end of the evening, Jennifer asked me to say a few words. I hadn't prepared anything, but I stood up in front of the crowd and tried to express what the past year had taught me. I didn't set out to be anyone's hero, I said. I just wanted to keep a stone wall that I liked that came with the property I bought. But fighting for that wall taught me something about what matters. The people who built that wall put their backs into it, stone by stone, because they needed it. They built it to last. And we have a responsibility to the past and to the future to preserve things like that. Things that connect us to the people who came before and will outlast us for the people who come after. People applauded, and I sat down feeling awkward but also feeling like I'd said something true. Later, Paul Mackenzie came up to me with a beer and clinked his bottle against mine. "That was good," he said. "And you're right. We should protect the good stuff, the stuff that matters, not just because it's old but because it's well made and it tells a story." As fall turned to winter and then to spring again, life continued in its rhythms. I worked from home, maintained my property, took walks with my dog along the nature-preserve trails. The stone wall was always there, a constant presence, marking the boundary between my space and the wild area beyond. I started dating someone that second spring, a woman named Michelle Morris I'd met at one of the Historical Society events. She was an architect who specialized in historic preservation, and she loved the wall almost as much as I did. She'd walk the length of it with me, pointing out architectural features I'd never noticed, talking about the people who might have built it and what their lives would have been like. "You realize you're probably never going to be able to sell this property now," Michelle said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the stones gold and amber. "Why not? Because this wall is part of you now. You fought for it, preserved it, made it yours in a way that goes beyond just legal ownership. How could you ever leave it behind?" She was right, and I knew it. This property, this wall, had become home in a way my previous houses never had. I'd put my stake in the ground here, literally and figuratively. I'd stood up for something that mattered, and I'd won. That meant something. The second anniversary of Sharon's initial visit came and went without incident. I marked it privately, sitting on my porch in the early morning as I'd been doing when she'd first marched up my driveway. Everything looked the same but felt completely different. The wall was still there, protected now by law and by community recognition. Sharon was gone. Her brief reign over the HOA ended in disgrace. And I was still here, guardian of a piece of history I'd never built but had fought to preserve. David Chen called me occasionally to check in. The case had been good for his practice apparently, raising his profile as someone who'd take on HOA cases and fight for property owners' rights. He'd taken on several new clients dealing with similar situations, though none quite as dramatic as mine. "You started something," he told me during one call. "People are pushing back against HOA overreach all over the state now. Your case made them realize they don't have to just accept unreasonable demands." I was glad something positive had come from all the stress and conflict. If my fight had made it easier for others to stand up for their rights, then maybe it had all been worth it. Thomas Reeves stopped by one more time, 2 years after his initial survey. He wanted to document how the wall had weathered over time and check that the repairs Frank Morrison had made were holding up well. They were, of course. Good work endures. "You know what's interesting?" Thomas said as we walked along the wall. "I've been doing surveys for 30 years, and this is the first time I've seen a stone wall become the center of such drama. Usually, they just sit there, invisible, until someone wants to build something and we have to figure out where the property lines actually are. I guess Sharon made it impossible to ignore." "She did that," Thomas agreed. "But you made it impossible to ignore for better reasons. This wall matters now, not just as a property boundary but as a symbol of preservation and community heritage. That's entirely because you fought for it." Michelle moved in with me that summer. She had ideas for the property, ways to honor its historic character while making it more functional for modern life. We added a small garden shed built using traditional techniques that Frank Morrison helped us with. We planted heritage varieties of vegetables and flowers that would have been common when the wall was built. We installed solar panels cleverly hidden from street view to power the house sustainably. The property became a living museum of sorts, a place where past and present coexisted. The ancient stone wall stood guard over gardens planted with Victorian vegetables and heated by 21st century solar technology. It worked because we weren't trying to recreate the past or deny it. We were building on it, honoring it while moving forward. Jennifer Costa's term as HOA president was so successful that she was re-elected twice more. Under her leadership, the HOA became what it was supposed to be, a way for neighbors to cooperate and maintain their community, not a miniature dictatorship. Violation notices became rare and were only issued for legitimate problems. The budget was spent on community improvements instead of enforcement actions. People actually looked forward to HOA meetings instead of dreading them. Sharon's name became a cautionary tale in the neighborhood and beyond. "Don't be a Sharon" became shorthand for not abusing small amounts of power. Local news occasionally did follow-up stories on the case, usually around the anniversary of her arrest, using it as an example of HOA power gone wrong. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Sharon had moved away, leaving Massachusetts entirely for somewhere in Florida. I hoped she'd found some peace and learned something from the whole experience, but I didn't spend much time thinking about her. She'd been a problem in my life for a brief moment, and then she was gone. The wall remained. Frank Morrison became a good friend. He'd stop by occasionally to check on the wall, never charging for these visits, just wanting to see how his work was holding up. He brought his grandson sometimes, a boy of about 10 who was learning the family trade. I'd watch them work together, Frank's weathered hands guiding the boy's smaller ones as they fitted stones together, and I'd think about continuity and tradition, and the way knowledge passes from generation to generation. "Your wall is going to teach a lot of people," Frank told me once. My grandson, for one, but others too. People are finally starting to care about this stuff again, about craftsmanship and history and building things that last. 3 years after the whole ordeal began, the Massachusetts Historical Commission held a ceremony recognizing the state's most significant historic stone walls. Mine was one of 12 chosen from across the state. The ceremony was held at the State House in Boston, and I was asked to speak about the wall's history and preservation. Standing in that ornate building, surrounded by preservationists and historians and government officials, talking about a stone wall that some unknown farmer had built nearly 2 centuries ago, felt surreal. But it also felt right. The wall deserved recognition. The people who'd built it deserved to be remembered, even if we didn't know their names. After my speech, a woman approached me. She was elderly, probably in her 80s, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "My name is Dorothy Hutchinson," she said. "I believe my great-great-grandfather built your wall." I was stunned. We sat down in a quiet corner and she told me the story. Her family had kept records, journals and documents passed down through generations. Her great-great-grandfather, Josiah Hutchinson, had cleared that land in 1847 and built the stone walls that marked his property boundaries. She had a journal entry where he'd written about the work. "Spent 3 weeks on the eastern wall," she read from a photocopy of the journal. "The ground was full of stones, a curse when trying to plow but a blessing for wall building. The wall stands straight and strong. It will serve my children and their children well." I felt emotion well up in my throat. Here was proof that the wall wasn't just old, it was personal. It had been built by a real person with a name and a family, built with hope for the future. And I'd preserved it, kept Josiah Hutchinson's work standing for his children and their children, even generations beyond what he could have imagined. Dorothy gave me copies of the journal entries and some old family photographs. In one, taken around 1890, you could see part of the wall in the background, already old then, already permanent. I had the photo framed and hung it in my hallway, a reminder of the wall's human origins. The story came full circle in a way I never expected. Michelle and I got married in the backyard, with the stone wall as our backdrop. Frank Morrison and his grandson were guests, as were David Chen and Thomas Reeves and Jennifer Costa, and so many neighbors who'd supported me through the fight with Sharon. Dr. Foster officiated the ceremony, and in her remarks she talked about foundations and permanence and building lives on solid ground. As Michelle and I exchanged vows with that ancient wall behind us, I thought about all the events that wall had witnessed. Seasons and storms, births and deaths, the slow transformation of farmland into suburb. Wars had been fought and ended while those stones stood unchanged. Technologies had been invented that would have seemed like magic to Josiah Hutchinson. And through it all, the wall endured. Now it would witness this too. Two people pledging their lives to each other, making promises they intended to keep, building something meant to last. The wall blessed our union with its presence, its permanence, its reminder that good work echoes through time. Years have passed now since Sharon Whitmore first marched up my driveway demanding I tear down the wall. Life has moved on, as life does. Michelle and I talk sometimes about the children we might have, the life we're building together on this property with its history and character. When those children come, they'll grow up playing along the stone wall, learning its history, understanding that they're part of a story much larger than themselves. The wall still stands, of course. It will stand long after I'm gone, a testament to Josiah Hutchinson's labor and my determination to preserve it. Other people will own this property someday, and I hope they'll appreciate the wall and protect it as I did. The legal protections are in place now, the historical documentation is thorough, and the story is part of the public record. But more than that, I hope they'll understand what the wall represents. The idea that some things are worth fighting for, that history matters, that good work endures. Sharon Whitmore tried to destroy the wall out of spite and a misguided sense of power. She failed because the wall was bigger than her petty authority, because the past is not subject to HOA regulations, because some things are simply beyond the reach of small-minded bureaucracy. I sit on my porch sometimes in the early morning, just as I was doing when this all started, drinking coffee and looking at the wall. The stones are covered in dew. The moss is green and vibrant, and the morning sun makes everything glow with a warm light. The wall is beautiful, yes, but it's more than that. It's a connection to the past and a promise to the future. It's evidence that humans can build things that last, that our work can outlive us and matter to people we'll never meet. That's what I fought for in the end. Not just a pile of rocks, but the principle that good work deserves protection, that history matters, that we have obligations to both the past and the future. Sharon Whitmore couldn't see that, blinded by her need for control and her inflated sense of authority. But the wall saw her come and watched her go, unmoved and unchanged, still standing strong. And it will still be standing long after all of us are gone, a monument to the perseverance of well-made things and the vindication of those who fight to preserve them. That's not a bad legacy for a stone wall built by a farmer in 1847, or for a man who refused to let it be destroyed in 2024. The sun rises higher, warming the stones and burning off the morning mist. I finish my coffee and stand up, ready to start another day. Before going inside, I walk over to the wall one more time and place my hand on its rough surface, feeling the cool stone warm slowly under my palm. This simple gesture has become a ritual, my way of checking in with the wall, acknowledging its presence and permanence. The stone is solid and real under my hand, unchanged by all the drama and conflict it inadvertently caused. And that, I think, is exactly as it should be. Some things are simply beyond the reach of petty disputes and temporary authorities. Some things just endure, silent and strong, waiting patiently for people to remember what truly matters. I head inside to start my day, leaving the wall to its quiet vigil, confident that it will still be there tonight when I return, and tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows to come. That confidence, that assurance of permanence in an impermanent world, was worth every moment of the fight to preserve it.